Hi, I'm Chris,
And I'm Terry.
and welcome to another summer school lecture. So today we're going to be departing from the neural engineering framework. So for the last 3 or so lectures, we've been looking at principles 1 through 3 of the neural engineering framework. And then Terry showed us how we can put a bunch of things that we built together to start creating something which looks like sort of a mini brain. But of course, we ran into some interesting scaling issues there. Like, how are we going to make things a lot bigger? And that's really what we're going to focus on today, is looking at the semantic pointer architecture, which is a series of techniques which use the NEF in order to build really large-scale brain models, all the way up to and including things like SPAN. So before I get to an overview of the semantic pointer architecture, what I want to do is remember back to the second lecture where we were discussing different approaches to understanding the mind. And the first of those was symbolicism, where we take sort of a language-derived view, think about the mind as a kind of computer, use symbol-like representations, if-then types of rules, and so on in order to explain cognitive function. Then we also talked about connectionism, which took a kind of opposing view where really learning became central and the models themselves became sets of nodes which were connected kind of brain-like, but really different from symbolicism in the sense that the representations were spread across many different nodes that were connected into networks that then did some interesting function, which was explaining how minds worked in some particular way. And of course, connectionism was able to explain statistical behaviors that you find in cognition, the ability to recognize something in a lot of noise or pick out patterns which are fairly subtle and complex. And then a third approach was dynamicism, which I related to the third principle of the NEF, a view where the essential temporal properties of cognition are brought to the fore and really made to be essential. That is, we think that, cognitive systems are dynamical systems, complex and sophisticated ones, and that leaving time out of the picture would just be a fundamental mistake. Now, as I described the NEF, I didn't really talk much about how it related to each of these views. I did mention the relation to dynamicism just insofar as the third principle focuses on dynamics. I also mentioned a lot of connectionist related ideas, things like high dimensional vector representations and so on. Didn't really talk much about symbolicism. And one way of thinking about the purpose of the SPA, or all of the techniques we'll be talking about over the next couple of lectures, it's really a way to unify all of these different approaches. That is to take the insights from connectionism, which allow us to model the sort of statistical aspects of cognition, incorporate time varying behaviors that we find accentuated in dynamicism, and be able to represent concepts, language, rules, planning, all of the sorts of things that symbolicism excelled at. So I mentioned at the very beginning that one way of starting to unify our understanding of the mind is just by realizing that brains are physical systems and to really focus on the physics. And that's a good reason to start with neurons and spiky neurons and so on. But you do at some point have to get all the way back up to symbols, statistical reasoning, and high-level cognition. And that's what we want to do with the semantic pointer architecture. So the purpose in some sense is to try to unify these different approaches. And as I mentioned also in the second lecture, the way to do this is by taking essentially a synthetic approach, or at least a more synthetic approach than what people have done in the past, where the more is trying to emphasize 2 things. One is that we really need to scale. If we want to explain cognitive behaviors, then those are going to be large models if we think that our models are modeled at the level of neurons. And we want to make sure that the behaviors are complete in some sense. So we'll be able to convince ourselves more that it is something like a cognitive model at the neural level if we have the same inputs and outputs that we get from biological systems. So what have people done to this point in the context of building these kinds of models? That is, starting with single neurons and trying to build something big enough that we might think of as at least moving towards cognition. I think this is kind of an interesting story. So far, the story goes something like this, at least from my perspective, totally unbiased, of course. So in 2012, we published a paper in the journal Science, which described this large-scale model that I talked about before called SPAN. This didn't impress everyone. So for instance, Henry Markram said it's not a brain model. And one reason that he cared, of course, is because he was building his own brain model, and they were very large and complicated and also running on supercomputers. And the reason he thought it wasn't a brain model essentially was because he didn't feel that the individual neurons in our SPAN model were sufficiently detailed to make the overall model a brain model. So I disagreed and had an opportunity to write an article in which I argued that, in fact, yes, it is a brain model, and that the level of detail in your neurons should really depend on exactly what kinds of questions you're trying to answer. And when you're trying to answer questions like, how do we implement cognition, we need to have many neurons. In the case of the original Spawn model, is about 2.5 million. And we wouldn't be able to model each of those with a lot of detail, 15 or 20 equations per cell, just given computational constraints. So I argued that, in fact, it is a brain model, and that the amount of detail we have should really be dependent on questions we're asking, and not some sort of, fundamental number of equations or some other way of measuring the sophistication of your neurons, which is going to determine whether or not it's a brain model. Then Markram and his group published in 2015 a model in which he was arguing that this model was a brain model. And of course, it had many equations per cell. It had about 50,000 neurons in it, but each neuron had, I think, on the order of 6 to 15 equations per cell. And they were, highly interconnected. They were interconnected in a way that statistically resembled the part of the brain that they were looking at. And they were able to show that some aspects of the physiology was reproduced, certain kinds of voltage patterns, but I was unimpressed in some ways by the functionality that it did not exhibit. So it didn't really do anything, I think it's fair to say. There were some fairly simple explorations of the kind of behavior of the model. It wasn't behavior in the sense of actually, it's like controlling an arm or answering a question or anything. It was more in terms of sort of high-level characterizations of activity across the whole population. But I think more importantly, in 2015, we proposed this biospawn model. So this is one I also showed before in the first lecture, if you remember back, where we took parts of spawn and replaced them with neurons, which were as sophisticated as those found in the Markram paper. And then said, we're doing this for a reason. We're not just adding complexity because Markram has told us to. It's because we can now answer questions about what happens if we put drugs that interfere with the ion channels we've now included in our cell, and we can, answer interesting questions in that way. So I think that it was an example where it includes both biological detail, at least in parts of the model, as well as scaling and functionality. And even more recently, I also showed some results from Spawn 2.0, which I think is even better in various ways. It's sort of more functional. So of course it has more neurons, but it's also more functional. And at this point, we're working towards also including additional biological detail into sort of biospawn 2.0. That's something that we haven't published yet and is not complete at this point. But I think sort of moving this state of the art in large scale brain modeling forward is not a matter of just including complexity for complexity's sake, but it's doing it either with a view to answering particular kinds of biological questions or with a view to improving the functionality, that is getting more cognition, more behavior out of the model. So I think we really shouldn't sort of contrast bioplausibility and function, right? That's sort of what's happened in this large scale modeling discussion or story so far. But really what we want to do is make sure that there's always function, and then the degree of bioplausibility is something that should come along depending on what questions we're answering, what data we're comparing to, and so on. So ultimately the problem, I think, with a lot of large scale brain models is that they tend to ignore the function part. That is, they just provide a lot of complexity. So, they're obviously complicated. They need supercomputers to run, there's no doubt, but you don't get the function part out. And if we're trying to do something like unify symbolicism, connectionism, and dynamicism, then we can't merely add complexity. Those are really all approaches focused on functionality. What do minds do and how do they do it? Interestingly, this notion that large-scale modeling is important and actually a significant challenge is not a new one, perhaps unsurprisingly. And Jeff Hinton, during his presentation at a cognitive science conference 10 years ago this year, in fact, I thought had a really pithy way of making this observation. So he quoted from The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. He said, "In The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, a fearsome intergalactic battle fleet is accidentally eaten by a small dog due to a terrible miscalculation of scale. I think that a similar fate awaits most of the models proposed by cognitive scientists." And to that I would add, and maybe theoretical neuroscientists as well. So we want to be careful that just because we come up with a technique that works at a small scale, that is not in any way going to guarantee it's going to be successful when we scale it up. Scaling is its own problem, right? And we don't want to have a terrible miscalculation where we think that something that's working at a small scale, we just need more of that and then we solve the brain or we solve cognition. Instead, we have to treat scaling as a challenge in its own right. So that really is the purpose of the semantic pointer architecture, is to think about how can we start with something like the NAF, where we can take lots of different kinds of functions and compile them, as it were, into a bunch of spiking neurons, right? How can we take that and actually understand what the mind's doing? Because one way of understanding the NAF is it basically tells you how, if you know a function, a brain might compute that function. But it doesn't say anything about what functions brains compute. So that's a whole slew of really important questions that remain unanswered. The semantic pointer architecture is, a very first tiny little attempt to try to begin to move towards answering that question. I think we're, definitely far away. But we have some reason to think that because we can build models like Spawn, the components that we have in the semantic pointer architecture are at least a reasonable starting point. So the SPA is using the NEF to build cognitive models. And in the book, I basically break down those components into 4 different sort of subsections or kind of problem to worry about. And those in particular are semantics. That is, how do neural states in brains get meaning or relate to states in the world? Syntax. So this is really driven by the observation that, of course, the symbolicists were building lots of really interesting models and are still building lots of really interesting models. And they do it by essentially having representational substrates that very naturally encode syntax, right? It kind of starts with syntax. That's why it's language-like. If we start with a bunch of high-dimensional vectors, and we're worried about vector spaces and dynamics in those vector spaces, how do we get syntax? How are we going to make sure that we can actually represent symbol-like structures that seem to be prevalent in cognition? Control. So even if we can solve problems related to representation, which is what the first 2 problems are, we still need to solve a lot of problems about how information moves through the brain. As I like to point out, the nice thing about Spawn is that it's the same model that's able to do lots of different tasks, up to 12 now, right? And it's not the case that we have to reprogram it or we have to make information flow through it in different ways externally. It takes care of that on its own. And that all relates to control and moving information through the brain in sophisticated and subtle ways. And then last, learning and memory. Obviously, brains are incredibly impressive in their adaptability. This is true over the lifetime of animals. As well, memory plays a critical role to a lot of that adaptability, both short-term and long-term memory. So no architecture would be complete without addressing these issues. And of course, you will be surprised to see some of our answers because we've already looked at things like learning and memory in the context of the NEF. But the question is, how do those scale? How do we relate that to things like reinforcement learning or other kinds of learning that we think are biologically plausible? Okay, so with that in mind, let me dive into the sort of main conceptual element of the semantic pointer architecture, which might be unsurprisingly called semantic pointers. So this is a kind of representation. It's a representation which I think is often most easily understood by thinking of starting with a specific example, and then we'll generalize from there. So the semantic pointer would, for instance, be the activity at the top level of a visual hierarchy kind of model. So here's a standard example that I just stole out of a paper, where on the left-hand side, we have the Fellman and Van Essen sort of standard model of the visual system in the macaque. And on the right-hand side, we have a little bit more information about the representations and so on going through, in particular, the ventral stream of the visual system. So if you focus on the right-hand side, the couple of interesting things can be noted. So one is that as you go up the visual hierarchy here, you actually have fewer and fewer neurons. What that means is that there has to be some kind of compression going on. If I don't think that the neurons are different at the top of the hierarchy than they are at the bottom, which we have no reason to believe is the case, then having fewer neurons means that there's going to be less information in an information theoretic sense, so fewer bits. But how can we encode those complicated scenes at the bottom with fewer bits? Well, that means that the features are going to have to be more complicated and more sophisticated, and that's essentially what we typically see when we look in the visual system. But from the perspective of semantic pointer architecture, the notion that there is some kind of compression happening through this hierarchy is an important one, right? It means that we have essentially less information to worry about or have to manipulate at the top of the hierarchy. The idea is that this compressed representation is something that we could treat kind of like a symbol. So I've got symbol in quotes there. Usually if I'm being careful, I'll say this is a symbol-like representation. We don't want to confuse it with symbols because they have different properties sort of from a philosophical perspective. So I might accidentally say symbol, but I always mean symbol-like. In any case, so there's some, set of neurons. So we can think of that as an activity. In the NEF, of course, we would think that those neurons are encoding some vector space. So that vector would be something that we might be able to treat like a symbol. We could essentially, take it off of this top level, put it in a memory, store it in the memory, move it around. Because it's not as complicated as this bottom level, that means we have a lot less information to manage, which is great from an efficiency perspective. But ultimately, we want to sort of decompress it. We might want to ask questions about, features that might have been somewhere down here in the hierarchy, right? So if we start with cows and, we have all the spots and everything represented, but up here we just have some very abstract features that capture cowness. If we want to know about the spots, we're going to have to come back and ask questions about features that are sort of farther down the hierarchy. And that will require a kind of dereferencing or decompression of that representation. Doing that kind of dereferencing would be like a reactivation of a visual representation. And there's reasons to think that, all those backwards projections that go down the visual hierarchy in biological brains might be doing exactly that kind of thing, right? They might be setting up expectations or sort of determining how, if I have a representation at the high level, low level features would have given rise to that representation to make inferences about the nature of those features. So the idea, just to be succinct, is compression going up through the hierarchy. The compressed representation acts like a pointer in a computer science sense of pointer, which can be used and manipulated efficiently, just like pointers in computer science. To dereference the pointer, we can perform a kind of decompression, and that's going to capture information about these lower levels. So just to elaborate a little bit on what I mean by a computer science-like pointer. So in computer science, pointers are basically addresses to locations in memory. And they're kind of wonderful things because they're very small, and we can do things like pointer arithmetic, and we can manipulate pointers in various ways, instead of having to take the entire contents of the memory and manipulate it in the same way. So the idea with these semantic pointers is that that kind of efficiency is something that they share with these computer science pointers. But of course, they're also slightly different. They're semantic, right? So what do we mean by the semantic part? Okay, so yes, as I just described, semantic pointers are these compressed content-based addresses to information. In association cortices is just kind of generalizing from looking at the visual cortex in particular. As I mentioned, we call them pointers because, like a computer science pointer, we can use them to get at that big memory if we need to. That is, we can do a decompression or a dereferencing. But they're also semantic because they define a kind of surface semantic space. And that's what this golf ball is supposed to be showing down here, which we often refer to as the conceptual golf ball, where you can imagine that, I have a concept here. This might be my concept cat. Then I have another representation of a concept which is maybe related to cat, like tiger. So these could be close in concept space, and maybe things very unrelated, like cows, could be far away in concept space. The point is that when we've done the compression, we still have a space like this, right? So you can imagine on the previous slide where I had a picture of a cow and then it got compressed through the visual hierarchy. If I take the representation at the very top of that hierarchy, that would have been my cow representation, right? And if I take the same visual system and I put a cat into it, right, then at the high level, I'll get a representation. But because the compression is based on the pictorial content, right, then sort of the similarity of the high level vector representation, that is the similarity between cow and cat after compression, is going to give us some information about how related those two original inputs were. And that's this surface semantic space that semantic pointers are thought to capture. Okay, if we want to get to the deep semantics, right, then we have to do this dereferencing and so on. And we can do that, of course, because they're supposed to be acting kind of like pointers, that is pointing to that compressed information. All right, so hopefully that gives a sense of what semantic pointers are. And now I'll talk about them a little bit more and give a few more examples to try to flesh this out and give you an intuition of what we're talking about. So here we can think about an example, again, applied to the visual system. And in fact, this is the visual system that we used in the first spawn model. So here it's going to be encoding numbers, right? So We can look at the encoding of those numbers using the features at various levels. So these are the features that were used at the very first level, right? So these look a lot like tuning curves from primary visual cortex. We can also take a look at sort of the average features at the highest level. So these we can think of as basically taking a whole bunch of example inputs, right? So these would be the specific examples, like these are just particular images. If we compressed all of those through our visual system and then averaged them, we'd get what we see here in B, right? So this is like the average of all the high-level semantic pointers. So in some sense, we could think of those as our concepts of these numbers that we're being able to represent through our visual system. And then we can also see how good of a job can we do of reproducing some low-level features given a high-level representation. And that's what we're showing in D. So basically, if you look at the first item here in D, this is starting with this number 6. It's compressing it up into this sort of concept space and then decompressing it back down into a visual space and reconstructing the image. And you can see that, that 6 looks a little bit blurry, but a lot like the original 6. Similarly, this 8 has the same kind of slant as this 8, right? And so we can see that some of the specific features of those numbers are being captured, even when they're mapped into this sort of conceptual space that is being represented in B. And in fact, we can take a whole slew of examples of different kinds of numbers and plot them in a 2-dimensional space. We never compress them down that far. We only compress them down to about 50 dimensions in the original spawn model. But if you sort of further project that into a 2-dimensional space, then you can see clustering of the kind that we've got here, right? So this is basically a depiction of that surface semantic space I was talking about, where we've depicted it in only 2 dimensions, but you can still see that numbers of this variety all tend to cluster together. I'm not sure exactly what number that is. I think that's a 5, right? All of the 3s seem to cluster together. It looks like 3s are more similar to 5s than they are to other numbers like 0s and so on, right? So you can begin to see some surface semantic relationships being captured in the compressed space, in the semantic pointer space. I also find it oddly fascinating that when I look at these numbers, they remind me of the way that my kindergarten teacher used to write, or the very sort of clean kinds of numbers that you're taught about. If your handwriting is great, this is what they tend to look like. Mostly, in any case, except for the number 2. The number 2, I think the reason it's got such a fuzzy bottom there is because some people draw it with a loop and some people draw it with a straight line on the bottom, and so those have kind of been blurred together. In any case, we can also look at that same representation over time. So this is another way of observing the sort of visual system of spawn. We saw the previous case down, which I'm just reminding us of down here. The spawn 2.0, of course, we do have a much more sophisticated visual system with color images and so on. But in the original spawn model, it's a little bit easier to depict the compression. And basically, each of these are vectors. And you can see they're getting smaller and smaller. So we're compressing more and more until we get to the final layer, where now we're representing not just the vector, but also the neural activities. So here we've actually got spiking neurons. And in the previous ones, we're just representing state spaces. So it is a little bit different.
Just for clarity there, in the spawn model, those early layers were spiking. We're just not showing them as spiking in this picture. Exactly,
that's right. So we're emphasizing sort of the fact that we can move between state space representations and spiking representations. And the reason that we get bigger in the spike case is now we're dealing with noise and all the kinds of things that make us add a few neurons per dimension. But in any case, you can still see that things run fine. We can do the classification. It all happens over time. And unsurprisingly, since we saw this more sophisticated model as well, it all works out quite well and has fairly high accuracy, et cetera. Okay, so the sort of main points to hammer home here are that semantic pointers are essentially just vector representations and spiking neurons, except they also have compression. And because of that compression, they capture a kind of surface semantics. And we always expect to be able to decompress them as well. And decompressing them can get us back to some sort of interesting low-level features that are captured by the high-level semantic pointers. So thinking in terms of Nengo, the challenge here is going to be representing high-dimensional vectors, right? As I mentioned, in the original spawn model, we had about 50 dimensions. And we've never seen anything quite that big in Nengo so far. So I think the first thing that Terry's going to talk to us about is how we might go about representing those vectors in a convenient manner inside Nengo.
So the core thing that we want to start pushing Nengo and scaling up to larger vectors, because we've sort of identified that we really want to be able to represent 50-dimensional vectors, 100-dimensional vectors, 200-dimensional vectors. We will see 500 or 700 ends up being good numbers as well. And in a certain sense, we can just do that using exactly the code that we've seen before, right? I mean, this dimensions thing, I can just put a bigger number in here, right? I could say, all right, we got 100 dimensions now. And okay, well, my stimulus input here, well, I can't just feed in a 0 anymore. Now I would have to feed in 100 zeros. So, all right, that's 100 zeros. And I'm probably going to need a few more than 50 neurons. I don't want to pick too big a number, but let's go to say 500 for now. And there's nothing to stop us from doing that. And I can run this model, and that would be perfectly fine. I could right click on this. I can say, okay, well, here, have some sliders so I can control the input to this model. And Nengo will quite dutifully make 100 sliders for me. And if I press play, all right, so we're now decoding 100 different values out of this group of neurons, and I can go ahead and feed some vector into this group of neurons, and we can see how well it represents that. There's nothing stopping us doing that. It's more, this is sort of a really impractical sort of thing going on right now. Like, if I have some particular set of slider, you know, some particular input that is supposed to mean cat and another input that's supposed to mean cow, I don't want to be manually moving these sliders around to try to do that. So what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to introduce some sort of software tools to Nengo to help with that process. Okay. At the base level, it's all just the same components, ensembles, and connections, and nodes and networks that you've seen already. All we're doing is we're adding in sort of like software tools to help automatically define these things, and adding in some tools to the user interface to help us manually show, to help us interact with these things better. What we're going to do is we're now going to need to install a new package for Python that will give us access to these tools. So the same way that when you initially installed Nengo, I'm going to switch to a browser window. When we installed Nengo in the first place, you did a pip install Nengo, and you did a pip install Nengo GUI. We're going to add one more thing to that. We're going to say pip install Nengo SPA, Nengo SPA. If you go ahead and do that, it will go ahead and download the software tools for that are going to help us with these semantic pointer stuff. Okay. And then we're going to run Nengo again. Of course, you only have to do that once. Yeah, now that we've installed Nengo SPA, we now can make use of these new tools that we've just installed. So first thing I'm going to do, let's make this, we're starting, let's do SPA examples. So we're going to call this SPA 1. There we are. And we're going to need to tell Nengo to get access to those new SPA tools. So we're going to say import Nengo SPA. I'm going to call it as SPA. This as syntax, that's just Python for, hey, I don't want to write the whole thing out Nengo _ SPA all the time. So instead, I just want to write SPA. No, we're going to go delete all these things. One small change that is going to have to happen is this network that we're basing everything in. We're going to use a slightly fancier network, or a new version of that network. It has, you know, it's the same capabilities as before, but this is just a slightly modified version that will support all the tools that we're about to show. So all we do is we change from Nengo.network to SPA.network. And all the things you can do with the Nengo network, you can also do with the SPA network. So that should be fine. We just get some new features. One of those new features is sort of a quick way of generating a group of neurons that is going to represent one of these large dimensional or these large semantic pointers. Okay. And it's going to have associated with it some nice graphing tools. Right. So I'm going to say, what are we going to call this? We're going to call this, I don't know, maybe this is supposed to be a model of the end result of vision. Okay, so I'm going to have a group of neurons that are supposed to be just storing the, whatever the semantic pointer is that is the representative of what I'm currently looking at. In a more advanced tutorial, we might actually implement the whole vision system. We're not doing that here. We're just saying, all right, let's say I have a group of neurons that is just going to be the end process of visual recognition. And what I'm going to call this, so what we're going to call this is we're going to call it a state. So this is just a new thing. This is a sort of a new component. It is just a Nengo network with a bunch of things in it, ensembles and connections. And the one thing we have to specify about that is what the dimensionality is. Since we're going to use this in a few places, I'm just going to define it up here. I'm going to say we're working with 64 dimensional vectors, and I'm going to say D is 64. And now I get this new block that is going to be our default neural representation of this 64 dimensional vector. This one thing that we're doing here, this block has components inside of it. That's something we haven't actually shown in Nengo yet, but you can put networks inside of networks, and then whatever you put inside that network is sort of encapsulated in there. If you double click on the network inside the graphical interface, you'll see what's inside it. Oh, what's inside is another network, and inside that is a bunch of ensembles and components and more ensembles and things. So this is just sort of highlighting that all this is exactly the same sorts of components we're seeing before. We're just encapsulating things a bit and sort of predefining things usefully. So for instance, there's a default number of neurons per dimension. And there's some default ways of, oh, this 64 dimensions, maybe we don't represent all of that in one giant ensemble. Maybe we're spending 16 dimensions, 16 of those dimensions is in one group of neurons, another 16 is in another group of neurons. Some defaults for organizing that sort of how the data is organized. But conceptually, it's going to be exactly the same as what we've seen before, in that we have an input, right? And that input, if I pull up a slider on that, that is just 64 sliders, and we have an output. Close that away, and if I run, now I can get, I'm getting just exactly what we saw before, that, okay, yes, it works like a normal ensemble. It's got some nice default set, that's about it. Again, this sort of graphical interface, not all that helpful. So now let's actually show, hey, there is a new graphical interface that was also introduced as part of this. And if I right click on this and remove it, I can do something like, oh, if I right click on my, on this new spa.state object, I now have two new graphing options. I have what we're calling a semantic pointer cloud and a semantic pointer plot. What are these? Click on the cloud first, and I get this new sort of empty window. And if I press play and run this, and if I right click on that new empty thing, I can have this set value option. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to type in cat. If I press enter right now, what in the world is it going to do? So Nengo is just, it's about representing vectors. What the system is going to do is it's going to see cat, and it's going to go, I have no idea what a cat is. Nothing's defined to me yet what a cat is. And so it's going to randomly generate a vector that from now on is going to mean cat. Okay. So it randomly generated a vector, and it's now using that as the input. And now we can sort of look at this output and we can say, oh, okay, yeah, that must be the vector for cat. We're randomly generating it because in this particular example, we don't have the big giant visual network that Chris was pointing at that would actually take an image and compress it down into some sort of representation. If you have such a network, if you have such a a big deep learning network or whatnot, fine, we can plug that in, use those representations, that's fine. We're going to use this sort of random compression as not a bad analog to that. Okay. But importantly, these are vectors. So for instance, well, okay, so things we can do with this. All right, so I can say dog, fine, that's going to randomly generate a new vector. Okay, I've got a new vector here. But I can also do things like, all right, cat plus dog. Right, and that's just going to do, all right, the vector that is the sum of those two things. It's all just vectors. I can also say, I don't know, 0.5 times cat plus 0.2 times dog. This graphical display over here, this cloud display, it's going to be indicated, as I said, 0.5 times cat and 0.2 times dog. The sizes of these texts, of this text, is going to be related to the vector itself. We'll see a more clear example of what the size of this text means in a moment. But I just wanted to point out that that we can just do this sort of math, and this is a fast way. The only thing this is doing is it's just a fast way of moving those sliders around. I don't want to manually, figure out what the slider settings are supposed to be for one representation and another representation and put them all back. I just want to be able to right-click on it and type something, and it'll go ahead and do that representation. So that's helpful for input. This output, this graph here is kind of useless. Right? This output, I mean, it is, okay, this is the 64-dimensional vector, but I can't look at that 64-dimensional vector and have it mean anything to me. That's just, what am I looking at there? So that's why we also have this semantic pointer plot cloud. And what this does is it says, all right, instead of plotting this big giant vector, the 64-dimensional vector, what I'm probably interested in is just what's the similarity between this vector and the vectors that I've defined. So I know what the vector is for cat, I know what the vector is for dog. Just plot for me the similarity between this vector and the one for cat and dog. And by similarity, I'm going to mean dot product. We choose dot product because that's a linear operation that we know that's easy for neurons to compute. And so it's an operation that should be pretty easy. So now I'm feeding in, well, let's feed in cat. Okay. I'm getting some vector out, and that vector is turning out to be 0.7 close, the dot product of that vector, it's not exactly cat, but it's 0.7 cat, or the dot product of it and cat is 0.7, 0.8, somewhere around there. And the dot product of that vector and dog is around 0, what we would expect. And of course, I can do things like cat plus dog. All right, so now it's still this one vector being represented, but that vector has a high dot product with both cat and dog, as you would expect. We would also have, I don't know, 0.8 cat plus 0.5 dog plus, I don't know, 0.1 or, I don't know, 0.7 rat, I don't know, just something. Okay. So it's just a vector. So these two graphs are two ways of graphing the same thing, sort of. But I find this one up here ends up being generally more useful because it's indicating the similarity of that vector to the things that I'm interested in. That also brings us back to what the sizes of this text on the left here in our input graph is. Those sizes of those texts, those are proportional to these dot products. So that's just other ways of representing the same thing. So generally I find that those are the graphs that I'm going to use, and I'm just going to remove that plot because I don't find it particularly meaningful. Okay, so we have this group of neurons that can represent a vector. fine. That's not all that different. I mean, we've got this nice user interface that sort of lets me put in vectors. There's some syntax if you want to manually define that cat means this particular vector and dog means this particular vector. You can go ahead and do that. Things get a little bit more interesting when we start building up larger things with this. So for instance, fine, I can feed in a vector. Can I store a vector over time? So I'm going to say some sort of like working memory, some sort of what have I been looking at recently sort of group of neurons. So this is another group of neurons. I'm going to connect the vision system to the memory system. Oh, so I want to make this a memory system. So I want to have it store information over time. This spa.state object has a nice parameter in it that sort of has a built-in way of doing that for you. So I can say feedback equals 1. The default feedback is 0. So that's all right. How much of memory am I, how much of the output of this thing am I feeding back into the input of this thing? So this ends up being the same as, hey, make this thing an integrator.
It's an integrator.
Yay, integrators.
They're everywhere.
So this is now a 64-dimensional integrator. Okay. And now we also need to connect, we're going to connect whatever's in this vision system to this memory system. We could do that. We have a couple different ways of doing that. So one way is we could do it using the standard Nengo syntax. I could make a connection from the vision output to the memory input. Okay. Because these things have so many different components in them, we need to do, say, something like memory.input in order to say where exactly we're making these connections to. And if we wanted to be an integrator, we would say something like, well, the transform is 0.1 and the synapse is 0.1. Right? Then it would actually be an integrator. So that's one way we could do that. As part of the SPA is we're also, because we're going to be making more complex connections like this in the future, and we'll see that in sort of the next example, we've sort of started introducing other syntax for doing the types of connections that we find are common with SPA structures. You can always fall back on the normal Nengo connection approach, but for the types of things that are really common in SPA, we've developed some custom syntax for that. And the idea for this syntax is going to be, all right, take whatever's in vision and send it to memory. Okay, so this new operator that we're using here, so we're using the double arrow operator as sort of a take the thing on the left and send it into the thing on the right syntax. Okay. Oh, and if we want to scale this by a little bit, so for instance, since really what we want is we want vision times 0.1 to be being sent to memory, then we can actually say that right here. So the attempt here is to try to make a concise syntax for the types of things that we find typical. And we'll see how all that works. But hopefully that's somewhat readable what that's doing. Now we have our semantic pointer plots. Let's make a cloud here. Sure, let's make a plot here. Let's see what this does. All right. So we are going to try feeding into this thing cat. Okay, I'm feeding in the vector cat. You can see the vector, there's a vector being stored in the memory. That vector is becoming closer and closer and closer, or the dot product of that vector and the ideal vector cat is becoming larger and larger and larger. We're now getting a dot product that's pretty close to 1. So the vector being stored in memory is probably pretty close to the exact cat vector. And now something I can do is I can take away that input, set the input to nothing. And now we see that the memory is indeed an integrator. It is storing the information. The vector is, it is not a perfect integrator. That vector is going to be drifting. It's actually, let's show that. I'm going to right click on this. I'm actually going to show the vector. That example again. I'm going to feed in cat. That's some vector that's being fed into the system. Whatever vector is being stored in that is becoming more closer and closer and closer to cat. This is what that actual vector is down here. I'm now going to take away that input. And the dot product is being pretty stable. This vector, if we stare at it, is going to drift. It's going to change. It's not a perfect integrator, but it's not bad. And indeed, we could play around with things like, okay, well, how long do we want to maintain that for? How far does it drift in a certain amount of time? I can also do things like, oh, all right, let's send in representation of vector for dog. All right. So we're going to feed in the vector for dog. That's being fed into the memory. The memory is now containing a vector that's kind of close to cat and it's kind of close to dog. If I keep feeding this in for longer, we're becoming closer and closer to dog. We're going to get farther away from cat. I can feed in, oh, if I feed in nothing now we're sort of maintaining that memory. That memory is pretty close to dog, kind of close to cat. Feed in something that's totally new. All right, here's a new vector. We're going to feed that in. I'm going to take nothing. And now the memory is storing something that's pretty close to rat, and less close to the other two. So you can do some fun things with this by saying, you can say, all right, well, how, if you have, you know, 100,000 words or however many words there are that a human knows, how big a memory, how many dimensions do you need and how big a memory do you need in order to maintain a certain amount of information over a certain amount of time. So we can start measuring working memory capacity in this sort of way. But the idea is going to be that this group of neurons, and importantly, when we created this group of neurons, we didn't, at that point, specify what all these vectors are for cat, dog, and rat. And this is just a group of neurons that's good at representing vectors. And even if we generate a totally new vector that the system has never seen before, indeed, we've seen 3 examples of that now. Those are 3 totally new vectors that the system's never seen before. It was just optimized across the entire space of all vectors, that it can store these information and store them over a reasonable amount of time. So back to Chris.
Great, thanks, Terry. So we've now seen how to store these high-dimensional vectors and how Nengo makes that particularly easy with Nengo SPA. And now I want to also just push the notion of semantic pointers a little bit. So we've been talking about it a lot in terms of vision, but it is intended to be a fairly general notion, and you can actually think of it in motor control in a fairly natural way as well. So I think for perception, it's a little bit easier to see in some ways. So, you know, images are fairly high dimensionals. There's a lot of pixels coming into your eye. Our representations of those get compressed. As we saw, we have fewer and fewer neurons representing them. And so the notion of compression and decompression, kind of going back out from a representation to more of those sort of low-level features, makes some sense. But in motor control, you can actually think about things in pretty much the same way. So in the case of the motor system, we're controlling the arm. The arm actually has on the order of 200 muscles, and we're controlling more than the arm, obviously, but if we just look at the arm, it has on the order of 200 muscles. But really, it only has 9 degrees of freedom, right? So this means that there's far more muscles than there are degrees of freedom. More than that, the end effector, so your fingers or your hand, can actually be oriented kind of into a 3-dimensional point, right? And you can sort of approach that point from any number of orientations. So that gets you down to about 6 dimensions. So as you kind of go from the way you would specify your target of your movement, which would be in terms of like a point and an orientation to that point. So that's 6 dimensions. And then, you know, you want to control the degrees of freedom of the arm, which is 9. So that's more than the number that you just specified. And the number of muscles you have to control is 200. You can see that the number of dimensions is essentially increasing as you go from sort of the most internal representation to the most external one. And that is analogous to the sort of backwards inferencing that you can think about in the perceptual system. So we kind of have flipped things on their head in some way. So in perception, you got a ton of images, you map it down to fewer concepts. In motor control, you have sort of fewer targets to specify, but then you map it out to a high-dimensional muscle system. You can essentially think of these as being duals of one another. So in the mathematical sense where, they are structurally similar problems, but they're just kind of flipped on their head in some fairly specific way. So I've drawn that specific way on this slide, where here we can see that, both of them have a kind of compression. So in the case of perception, it goes from the world to the sort of visual representations, and the compression goes also from the world to the motor representations. But when you think about the dominant flow of information sort of from the perspective of the brain, right, information's flowing in from perception, but it's kind of flowing out from motor control to the world, right? So that's kind of where things get flipped around in some sense. But the idea here is that semantic pointers can work just as well in both cases, right? So the motor system that we have in Spawn rather, is sort of described in detail in the book, and it starts with low dimensional representations of targets, and it increases those into higher dimensional representations across the number of degrees of freedom of the arm, and increases that up into muscles, right? So we have that same kind of thing, same sort of concepts about compression and decompression and learning, and all the same sorts of ideas work in both of these instances. And this in some ways is not a new idea by any stretch. So definitely people like Todorov and others have been talking about this duality of motor control and perception. But I think it's one that semantic pointers can really take advantage of and fit very naturally into. So I always think it's nice to sort of introduce this to people, just to give you a little extra something to think about. So you kind of introduced semantic pointers, which are new, and explain those in terms of vision, and maybe that starts to make some sense. But I wanted to make sure that it's not just tied to, for instance, thinking about vision and visual compression operators. There's also a whole slew of motor compression operators that we can think about, and motor decompression operators too. Okay, so if that's not enough, right, we also have ways of thinking about cognition in terms of semantic pointers. And so I'm going to get to that in a little bit more depth now over the next few slides. So why do we think there might be these semantic pointer-like representations? So I think, there's been a lot of experiments which are consistent with this idea. This difference between sort of surface semantics and deep semantics is not a new one. So for instance, we can look at a series of experiments that Solomon and Barcelou did quite a while ago that showed if you take different kinds of lexical pairings and present them to people, they can process some of them very quickly and some of them much more slowly. So for instance, imagine you're in a task where somebody says, I'm going to give you 2 words, and you have to tell me if the second word is a feature of the first word. Okay, so if I say dog card, you'll probably say no, because dog and card have nothing to do with one another. But interestingly, if I say banana monkey, you will also say no, but it will take you a lot longer. So the idea here is that these concepts of dog and card are very far apart. And so we can use our surface semantic space to make a comparison and quickly arrive at a solution. But banana and monkey are actually quite close together on our surface semantic space, because bananas and monkeys are kind of conceptually related in all sorts of ways. But monkeys are not a feature of bananas, right? And so the correct answer is no, but we would have to kind of do some dereferencing. We'd have to look deeper into our banana and monkey concepts to understand that relationship and see if it's actually a relationship of being a feature. And if it turns out not to be, then we can get the right answer, but that's going to take a lot longer. Why does it take longer? Well, presumably that's because we have to do these extra steps of doing some kind of decompression, right? Or looking into the sort of deeper semantic aspects of our conceptual representations. So Khan et al., this is also from Barcelou's lab, did the same kind of experiment and looked at fMRI. And they noticed that activation in perceptual systems only seems to show up in those difficult cases, in the banana monkey kinds of cases. Suggesting again that extra machinery is being brought online in order to do that deeper semantic lookup. So this kind of harkens back to what I was talking about with the visual system, where if we want to know something about the visual features, we might have to do a decompression to get to those lower level features, which are kind of compressed over in the high level representation. And so with concepts like banana and monkey, then it seems like maybe we have to do that kind of work in order to look at the features relevant for answering the question, whereas something like dog and card, we don't have to. So the overall story from this and many other related experiments is that it seems like deep processing is not really needed when a very surface-based or lexically based strategy can be sufficient to complete a task. And the idea is, if we think of these high-dimensional vectors to be concepts, kind of like Terry was talking about, where he just labeled them like cat and dog and so on. If we actually impose some kind of structure, so as Terry mentioned, when the SPA picks them. It just picks them at random using sort of standard ways of generating random unit length vectors, that they're really going to be unrelated to one another. Of course, our real concepts we think are related, and there's all kinds of interesting work in machine learning and other places where people look at, embeddings of words in order to generate vector representations of those words. And of course, that's the kind of thing that we think is ultimately going to be going on, and is actually going on inside larger models like Spawn. But in any case, the surface representation of those are basically what we think we could explain these kinds of results. But then we also need to encode that deeper semantics somehow. So that makes us run into the question of, well, how do you do that, right? How do you say that, the features of monkey are being furry and having 4 legs and screeching and being a mammal and all that kind of thing, and nothing in there has anything to do with bananas unless you look at the kinds of things they eat or something like that. So you need to encode structure, right? So this brings us to the second of those principles I talked about, which is the syntactic one, right? So first we were worried about semantics. That was the original discussion about high-dimensional vectors and compression through, for instance, a visual system. But now we're worrying about, well, how do we encode specific kind of cognitive relationships, so syntactic relationships? And these are clearly important. Probably this needs very little discussion when we're worrying about cognitive models. So pretty much every cognitive representation you might want to think of has syntax. So even the simplest things like lists, if I just have a list of items, there's a syntax there because that list has an order. And if we want to keep track of what thing comes before what other thing, that means we basically have some degree of syntax. Of course, language is the easy example. We've got grammars all over the place. And there's all kinds of work that goes into grammar, and looking at languages, probably the most obvious place where we'd find syntax. In general conceptual relations, there's a lot of very good evidence that these are hierarchically structured, and that a lot of specific kinds of relations are encoded in our conceptual hierarchy. So like what is a something? So, a dog is an animal, and so on. Those kinds of relations seem to be encoded. Part-whole relations are encoded, and so on. And lastly, whenever we are doing reasoning, we're often manipulating these kinds of structures, right? So not only do we want to represent syntax, we want to be able to manipulate things in a way which is syntactically sensitive. So this brings us to an example, which I'm going to use to introduce these techniques that we are going to use where we can encode syntax on vector spaces and perform syntactic types of manipulations on those same vector spaces. All right, so let me start with the example. So we're going to start with the example of thinking about a rule. So this is a fairly well-known experiment called the Wason card selection task experiment. And basically you can imagine that you go into a psychologist's office and they tell you the following rule. They say, I'm going to show you a bunch of cards, and on the card, there's going to be a number on one side and a letter on the other side. And here's a rule. If there's a vowel on one side, then there is an even number on the other. If I show you these cards, which of those cards do you have to turn over in order to verify if that rule is true? And usually I turn this over to the audience and see what people say. Maybe unsurprisingly, a lot of people say, well, you want to turn that one over, right? Because obviously there's a vowel on one side, so there should be an even number on the other side of that card. A lot of people will stop there. Some people will say that we need to turn over all the cards. There's actually only one other card that you need to turn over, and it's often fairly non-obvious to people. It's the last card, right? So if there is a vowel on the other side of this card, then the rule has been violated, right? Because of course, there have to be even numbers on the other side of the card. So this is often a less obvious answer. In fact, if you run these kinds of experiments, you get anywhere from about 10 to 30% of people choosing the correct answer. So there's widely varying, depending on exactly how things are presented and what's written on cards and so on. But generally, when you have this kind of abstract rule, people are not very good at reasoning about it. Now, the fascinating thing is that we can move to a different kind of rule with exactly the same structure, and people do really quite well. So this is going to be a social rule, one which any undergraduate is familiar with. It's going to be something like this. If someone is drinking alcohol, then they're over 21. So same exact setup. I'm going to show you a bunch of cards. There's going to be someone's age on one side and what they're drinking on the other side, right? So it might look something like this. And then I'm going to ask everybody, okay, which cards should you turn over to make sure that this rule is not being violated? And maybe unsurprisingly, everybody turns over both the 16 card and the beer card. So everyone knows if you're drinking beer, you better be over 21, and everyone knows if you're under 21, you better not be drinking beer, right? Super obvious. So you give this to undergraduates and 90% of them get it correct. So interesting, because logically speaking, these are exactly the same structure, but people do very well in this situation and not very well in this other situation. So there's all kinds of fun and interesting things to say about this. People have different kinds of theories about why this might work out this way. You know, because some people think that, you know, we're evolutionarily designed to detect cheaters. So there's a special part of our brain that is a cheater detection and is going to, you know, solve this task and not this task because there's no people in this task. Other people think that it has to do more with salience. Like you've been given this exact kind of rule many times and you've seen it over and over, so you can basically learn what it means. And in this case, you maybe are just misunderstanding what the logical structure is. For instance, you know, when your parents say to you, if you eat your peas, then you'll get ice cream, they don't mean this, right? They actually mean if and only if, slightly different logical structure. So you could definitely use that to interpret this rule and it would be fairly reasonable. Terry, did you want to jump in?
Just, and also as a sort of historical note, it was Chris's model of this task. It was actually the one that where I first found out about all the work that Chris was doing, and I decided I would just, you know, move to Waterloo and come join the lab because I really wanted to work on it more. But this was the actual task that got me into this whole thing.
So you're saying this was the most important paper I've ever written?
I'm fascinated. Joining you was the most important paper you ever written. It was a conference paper too.
It was a conference paper, but yeah, if it made you join the lab, I think it's a pretty important one.
Oh, thank you.
Right. So we're actually not going to dive into that paper, but I think the thing that, you know, Terry found interesting is what we're going to dive into. That is that you could build a spiking neural network that actually solve this task in some interesting way. And I'm not going to talk about that network, but I will talk about the techniques that we used to build this model. That is techniques which allowed us to represent the syntactic structure of those different rules, right? So what are we doing to represent syntax? And here I'm going to introduce essentially two operators. These are vector operators. And you can think of them both as being two different kinds of compression. So one is very familiar. This is going to be addition. Addition is a kind of compression because if I put two numbers in, I get one number out, right? So 3 plus 2 equals 5. Okay, so that's compressed in the sense that I took two one-dimensional vectors. So I've got 2 dimensions on this side and I have 1 dimension on that side. And the same thing is true if I take 10-dimensional vectors, right? If I add 2 10-dimensional vectors and get another 10-dimensional vector, I've done a kind of compression. Another kind of operator, which also does a kind of compression, is called circular convolution. So we often write this as convolution, like that. We can only do this between sets of vectors, so I'll just say v1 and v2, right? And this is going to give me some other vector v3. We can think of convolution after Tony Plate as a kind of binding operator, where, you know, vectors 1 and 2 we can think of as being sort of bound together in vector 3, right? So binding is going to be different for us than addition. Addition we can think of more as a kind of collection operator. So if we're going to add 2 vectors, v1 plus v2, that will also give us some other vector, which won't be v3, so I'll call it v4. Here we can think of those vectors as being collected together. And I'll say what I mean by collected. And here we're going to think of things as being bound together. And by collected and bound, essentially what we mean is we're identifying different relationships between the output, v3 and v4, and the input in each of these cases. So specifically for bound vectors, the dot product between the output and both of the input we'll think is close to 0. So it's essentially orthogonal. And for collected vectors, the dot product between the output and the 2 inputs will be equal and some fairly high number, right? So the examples that Terry was showing previously where he took cat and dog and put them in the same memory, they were essentially added together. And the dot product between what was in the memory and each of those vectors was high. If we do that with a bound vector through circular convolution, the similarity will between each of the inputs and the output will be very low, be close to 0. And because they have those different kinds of similarity, we can use them in different ways when thinking about syntactic structure. Specifically, we can use one as binding and the other as collecting. So if we have those operations, how might we represent something like, if there is a vowel on the one side of a card, then there's an even number on the other side? We can write things that look like this. So what we're doing here is we're basically saying there's a relationship between the antecedent and the consequent, right? So those are, you can think of as slots, right? Just generic slots. We could put all kinds of things inside there. For this particular rule, the relationship is one of implication. The antecedent is a vowel, and the consequent is there being something even on the other side. Okay, so this is our way of now having one representation rule which collects together each of these slot filler pairs, and together will encode the syntactic structure of the rule. Now, the reason we need two operators is because you can imagine if we just had plus, then essentially all of these things would get jumbled together and we wouldn't be able to tell if the antecedent was a vowel or if even was the antecedent, right? So if there's no way of differentiating summing from binding or collecting from binding, then we can't have a distinction between which items go into which slots. So that's really what we're getting here when we have this kind of set of operators. And I'll also mention that, of course, the dimensionality of all of these vectors is the same, right? So this really is compressed. So the particular operator we're using here, circular convolution, and the collection operator addition are both compressing, so we never increase the number of dimensions that we have in our output compared to the dimensions that are going in each of those other vectors. For that reason, that means we're losing information, right? We're definitely compressing, and we're gonna have to do some work to decompress to get that information back out. But we also, as a benefit, are being able to encode something that looks a lot like syntactic structure. Okay, so classically, if we were building a symbolic system, we would probably just write something down that looks kind of like implies vowel comma even, right? So we just have these sort of, we know that vowel is first and even is second, and the fact that we wrote it first means that it is the antecedent. And we wrote even second because it's the consequent. So we essentially have slots implicitly here, and we're putting those elements into those slots, those fillers. Okay, but we know that in our case, we're going to do something different, right? Instead, we're going to have this convolution operator, which I have a picture of a rote because, convolution is kind of like twisting things together. And if you actually look at the math that's going on behind this circular convolution, you really are effectively twisting these two vectors together. And of course, superposition we're all familiar with. It's just adding things together. Now, such a representation won't be useful if we can't ask questions of it. That is, if we can't tell what is in which slot, then there won't be a useful sense in which we've actually captured the syntax of that rule. But we can ask such questions. In particular, we might be asking the question, what is the antecedent? To do that, what we do is we compute the inverse of the thing we're asking the question about. So in this case, the inverse of the slot antecedent. And then we use the same binding operator to combine it with R. Now, because this is an inverse, so technically this little prime is not a -1 because it's not exactly the inverse. It's a kind of pseudo-inverse called the involution. And it works very well for the circular convolution, and it has much better numerical properties, and there's all kinds of reasons that you prefer to use it. But we can just think of, for present purposes, as basically the inverse. So we can do algebra to basically make us understand what's going to happen when we perform this binding operation, right? Namely, we're going to bind the inverse with the original rule. So this is the original rule R. The antecedent is going to be bound to, this is going to sort of be distributed across everything in here. So antecedent is going to be bound with this, antecedent is going to be bound with that. These two antecedents, which I've written out here, you basically got the inverse times the thing. So they're going to essentially cancel out and go to 1, right? And one is going to be convolved with a vowel, which means this is going to be equal to vowel, plus, and then we're going to have this term, which is going to be antecedent times implication times relation, and antecedent times, or antecedent inverse times consequent and even, right? So we're going to basically have all these other terms over here, which is approximately equal to vowel, right? So very close to vowel, plus a bunch of other terms, which we will think of as noise. Now, how can we just think of those as noise? Essentially, when we combine antecedent inverse with these other things which don't have antecedent in them, like the consequent, this is going to give us some other vector which is orthogonal to all the vectors that we sort of know about right now. So we're assuming that all of these vectors are in our vocabulary of the kind that Terry was defining. But because this one is orthogonal to all of those, it's not really going to be recognizable as something that we care about. And for that reason, it's noise, right? That's essentially what noise is. It's things that we don't recognize and hence don't care about. And if we can deal with that approximately equal and that noise, then we'll be able to extract this vowel, right? So I'll say a little bit more about, doing that. But hopefully the intuition here is fairly clear. That is, we can define two operators. We can use those operators differently to indicate binding or slot filler relationships and collection of a bunch of slots and fillers. We can then invert those binding operators to ask questions. So we could just as easily ask about what the consequent of the rule was. And that lets us extract the syntactic information, meaning that it was preserved. Okay, so this brings us to an important question, which we'll get to before we deal with the issue of noise. And that is, just a second, how do you do that circular convolution thing with neurons, right? It's not obvious that, okay, summation might be obvious. We know that when we inject two vectors into a population of neurons, essentially they get added together by default, more or less. But binding is obviously not addition. How do we know that neurons can do it? So this is where we're going to throw some math at you and hopefully convince you that this is surprisingly a natural operation for neurons to compute. Because this is convolution, for those of you who are familiar with convolution, in fact, we introduced it in the dynamics lecture, and we noted that when we took the Laplace transform, it turned all of our convolutions into multiplications. Here we're taking the Fourier transform, which is sort of a more specific version of a Laplace transform, and it's having the same effect. So it's also going to turn our convolution, in this case a circular convolution, into a bunch of multiplications. And multiplications, we do know, can be computed quite well by a bunch of neurons. So the way I'm going to write this out to be explicit is I'm going to say that we know that my circular convolution can be written as an element-wise multiplication. That's what this little dot is doing in the Fourier space. So I'm basically doing a Fourier transform of the first vector here, Fourier transform of the second vector here, that will allow me to take their element-wise products. And then to put them back in the original space, I'm going to have to take the inverse Fourier transform once I've finished doing that multiplication. The nice thing about Fourier transforms is, for a discrete length of vectors, so this is a fixed length vector, that means the Fourier transform and the inverse Fourier transform are going to be matrices because it's just a linear operator. And we also know that linear operations are the kinds of things you can very easily embed into the weights of neural networks, right? We saw examples of that already. And this is what I mean by it turns out to be the case that circular convolution is quite easy to implement in a neural network. In particular, it's going to be a neural network that will look something like this. So these are our two inputs, right? So these are like antecedent and vowel. We're then going to project them into a population here that is going to do the multiplication. And then we can read the results of that multiplication out by doing an inverse Fourier transform. And we're going to also have to be doing Fourier transforms on these two connections here, right? So that's where our Fourier transform will be. This will be the inverse Fourier transform. And this will be our multiplication. All right, so if we write, because those techniques that we saw about determining weight matrices for neural networks in order to perform computations we want, we can explicitly write down what the weight matrices will be. So here, this is omega ik, this is omega lk, and I will briefly apologize for a switch in notation here that I just noticed. These things are encoders, and these things are decoders. So we used to call encoders phi tilde and decoders phi, but that got very confusing for everyone concerned, so we switched to e's and d's. But this decoder here, then, you can see is the decoder, which is computing the element-wise product. That's what this a dot b is telling us. Okay, so we have the element-wise product. We have the inverse Fourier transform, which is a linear operation. So we're just combining them all together. And then alpha is our standard gain for our neurons and the encoders, right? So all components that we've actually seen before, and hopefully this makes some sense about how these are fitting together and where they'll be coming from. Okay, so we now know how to do that kind of binding operation. And so what I'll do is turn it over to Terry to let you build a network that looks something like this, where we take a couple of inputs, we bind them, and then we unbind them and hope that we get out what we stuck in. Terry.
So what we're going to try to do here is build an example of taking this information, having a network do that computation of binding the information together, storing that, and then trying to unbind that information. The particular example I want to do is sort of a historically interesting one for cognitive science, and that is the question of, or it gets referred to as the binding problem. And here's one way to phrase that. So given the system that we'd already built here, fine, I can represent a cat and a dog. If I had have said, all right, I would really like to have this, I want to have some neural representation of a cat and a dog. Fine, that's easy. All right, there we go. It's a vector. That vector is kind of close to cat. It's kind of close to dog. If I wanted to represent a blue circle, let's do something a little bit more complicated. Let's say I wanted to represent a blue circle. All right, that seems pretty easy. I could just say blue and circle. There we are. That's a new vector. I should let that vector load into our system. And hey, this is a vector that's kind of close to blue. It's kind of close to circle. But then there was this, like that, it was, very obvious how neural networks might be able to do sorts of things like this. But there was this famous paper by Ray Jackendoff where he points out that, hey, look, any theory of cognition that has anything to do with neurons is going to have to deal with the question, well, what if I want to represent a blue circle and a red square? Right? And the problem is that I can't just do blue plus circle plus red plus square and feed that in, because whatever that vector is, the vector for blue circle and red square is going to be the same as the vector for blue square and red circle. All right, so it's just another rephrasing of exactly what Chris was saying, of you need to have some way of encoding structure in this sort of system. But Chris has gone ahead and introduced a neat trick to do this. All right, and as Chris was saying, it was already known. Tony Plate did some work with this sort of math representation and showed that this circular convolution is a great operation. The main thing that we sort of did when we came in on this is say, hey, the operations that are needed, addition, circular convolution, and the inverse operation, are all really simple to implement in neurons, and then showing that it actually works at scale. So let's actually do that here. So what we're going to do is I'm going to say, all right, well, this user interface knows about the circular convolution. We use the multiplication sign, so blue circle. So that is going to be the vector for blue multiplied by circle. If I just feed that in, you'll notice that my display sort of drops out to nothing. It's like, okay, well, the vector that's being stored in here is not similar to any of these things. This isn't similar to anything here. None of this is similar to anything. And that's exactly the property of the circular convolution. When I bind two vectors together, the vector I get out is not similar to either of the inputs. But what we can do is we can have these graphical displays. We can say, all right, well, don't just graph the comparisons to all of the basic vectors. If I right click on this and I say show pairs, now it's going to graph the similarity to all the different pairs of combinations in the system. Right? And I can do the same thing on this vision thing. I can say show pairs. And now it's saying, okay, look, whatever vector is in there is pretty close to the ideal vector if I do the math for blue times circle. And it's also pretty close to the vector for blue times circle, which is one of those in that list there. Okay. Cool. So, but that's us manually doing the math. if we really want to actually say that neurons can use this as a representation, we need to actually show neurons implementing this operation. So let's build up a structure that can do that. So we've got the spot 2 example. We're going to have 2 different inputs. We're going to have one input that is going to be the shape. And we've got another input that's going to be the color. And then what I want in my memory, and for now we're just going to get rid of the feedback loop just to simplify our life a little bit. What I'm going to do is I want to say, well, I don't want to send shape to memory and color to memory. What I would really like to do is I would like to send color combined with shape, bound with shape to memory. All right, and so now we have this whole system that is built up. And what Nengo has automatically done now is it's gone ahead and implemented in here a nice efficient way of doing all of that pairwise multiplies. That's actually, so all of those different groups of neurons in there and in there are actually the ones that are computing all the pairwise multiplications. And then it's all just neural network stuff. And that's actually the only components inside that binding operation. And again, this is something you could define if you wanted to with your own ensemble and connections and the function approximation. It's all built with that. All we're doing here is making a syntactic shortcut of, oh, hey, look, if you just write that little multiplication sign, you will get this operation. You'll get this showing up for you. Okay. Go ahead and remove that. So this memory, I'm going to make sure the memory is showing pairs because that's going to be needed. I have a cloud over here and a cloud here. And if I run this, it's going to take a little while. So there are certainly, so this is probably the longest we've seen this gear spinning as it's going ahead and building that network. All right, now it ran. And so now I can do something like, all right, I'm going to set the color to blue and the shape to circle. And the memory now has in it a vector that is pretty close to the ideal vector for blue times circle. Okay. I want to sort of carefully highlight what we've done there. So we just built the network to compute any binding between any vectors. It did not know blue or circle. It had never seen these vectors before. It's entirely just at the user interface. When I type blue, it randomly generates a vector, calls that blue, randomly generates a vector, calls that circle. And this comparison here is, all right, whatever all this math of all of these, this is just a normal neural network. Indeed, it is just one hidden layer of neurons in the middle here. It's not a particularly deep network. And all we're doing is we're taking the output from this group of neurons, that's a vector, and we're comparing that vector to the ideal mathematical answer of blue times circle. And yes, it's pretty close to that. Right. And if I feed in something else, if I feed in red circle, then I get the vector for red circle. Circular convolution is red times circle is the same as circle bound, red bound with circle is the same as circle bound with red, whatever that's called. There's a term for that.
Commutativity.
So commutative. So yeah, circle bound with red is red bound with circle. That's why it's whatever order it shows up in, it shows up in. So we can say red. So that calculation works. I make a totally new vector square, red square. It's pretty good. So it's an easy thing for neurons to approximate. It's pairwise. It comes down to how well can neurons approximate pairwise multiplication, and pairwise multiplication is really easy. It's only a degree 2 polynomial. Like it's one of the easier, smoother functions to try to approximate. It's not as easy as a linear operation, but it is still pretty easy. So that means that I can compute this red square thing, but really the challenge of the binding problem is how do I represent red square and blue circle? So what I'm going to do to implement that is I'm going to actually turn this memory thing into a memory. So I'm going to put that feedback back in. So this is now an integrator. Okay. And that's the only change I'm going to make. I'm going to press play and run that again. Running. All right. So if I'm going to say, all right, I have blue. So I have a blue circle. That's being fed into memory. My memory now has a blue circle in it. Okay, so I'm running that. I'm going to take away that input. And you can see that I'm now remembering, okay, I saw a blue circle. All right, because that vector is still in my memory. I'm now going to see a red square. And now you'll note that I have a vector in my memory that is pretty close to blue circle and pretty close to red square. If I let that run for a lot longer, then the red square will overwhelm everything. So I've paused it. So I'm now going to take away the red, take away the square, taken away that input. And now I have a vector. I've computed a vector in my memory that is pretty close to blue circle, and it's also pretty close to red square. We've sort of shown that the information is there. We also need to show that neurons can extract the information back out. So now we're going to add in a system that can query this memory. So I'm going to make a query. And I'm going to make an answer. And what I'm going to do to generate my answer is it's going to be, well, I want to take whatever my memory is and combine it with the inverse of my query. And that's what's going to go to my answer. Okay, we are using, so just to sort of highlight there, the symbol we're using there is the tilde, the little squiggle mark on the top left of your keyboard, at least on some keyboards. So that's what we're using to denote the inverse operation. For those that are curious, the inverse operation turns out to be a linear operation. It's literally just taking the vector, the first element stays the same, and all the other elements, you just reverse their order. That turns out to be the pseudo-inverse. Nice and easy for neurons to compute. And we will go ahead and see whether or not this works. But now we should be able to feed something into memory, and then we should be able to query the memory and see what's in it. This is starting to be a fairly big model. I'm just actually going to print model.nneurons just to sort of see how big that is. So we're now at 68,800 neurons. This is now a 70,000 neuron model. Okay, and we're going to pull up a graph here for the query and for the answer. Okay, and now we're going to run this. Let it build. At least we have a nice little progress bar that lets you know mostly how long it's going to take. Of course, that last optimization step, it's sometimes a little fuzzy, but that's okay. Now we're good. So I'm going to set the value here to blue as my color, and shape is circle. All right, my memory now has blue circle in it. I'm just going to test that the query system works right now. So if I query it for blue, I should get out circle. It's good. Seems good. If I query it for circle, I should get out blue. All right, so that's sort of working. My memory currently has in it blue circle. I can take away my input. And now my memory is still storing blue circle. I can query it That still all works. And then the more important thing is I can now also feed in red square. I can get a vector that's pretty close to blue circle and a red square. And take away those inputs. And my memory has blue circle and red square in it. I can query it for red. I can get out square. I can query it for square. I get out red. I can query it for blue. I can get out circle. I can query it for circle. I can get out blue. And of course, we can do some fun things like, well, how many things do you want to load into this memory? How long is it stable for? You'll notice I rushed a little bit there. Like if I let this run for a little bit longer, right, this memory is not going to be stable forever. That red square is going to drift away. It's probably gotten worse at red right now. No, it's still not too bad. Certainly if we run it longer, or if we have a larger vocabulary set, because it's not just about how many things we loaded into memory. This answer thing that's coming down here, if there's 10,000 different words that I know of that I could possibly answer, that's going to mean that it's going to be, it's going to take less time to drift to one of those other possible answers, because there's just so many other possible answers out there. So it's going to be all sorts of interesting scaling questions about how well does this sort of approach work when we scale it up to human-sized vocabularies. But that's, which we'll talk about in a moment. But the core thing we want to highlight here is what we've built in this tiny little model is a solution to this binding problem. Yes, I can have a neural network represent a totally new combination of concepts that it's never run across before, and I can reliably query it and reliably access these different parts of that information. Okay? And all of the operations, everything is being done entirely in neurons. So the binding is happening, the addition is happening in neurons through the integrator. The circular convolution is happening in neurons, and that inverse operation is also happening in neurons. Okay. And so this is the sort of approach that we've used to scale up to build Spawn and lots of other things. Back to you, Chris.
Great, thanks, Terry. And definitely scaling is important. And the other thing that I promised to come back to is dealing with that noise. It's exactly the same noise that you were mentioning starts to play a role when you get thousands and thousands of potential vocabulary words. So what are we going to do about that? And what we're going to do is use something that people have thought about for a while, something called cleanup memory. Often they're not called cleanup memories, they're called associative memories. Basically the same idea. It means if I have a high dimensional vector representation of a concept and it can get noisy or fuzzy, how do I efficiently figure out what known vector is most similar to the noisy one? So this is a problem which has been around for neural networks for quite a while. And conveniently, we figured out a way that you can do this with spiking neurons. You do it quite fast and efficiently. And this is a really core part of being able to get these kinds of representations to work well in a cognitive architecture. I guess just as a little bit of background, people often refer to the entire class of representations which encode structure in vectors as being vector symbolic architectures. That class has a lot of different operators. So circular convolution is one. People also just use multiplication and addition and permutation. You can also do it for binary vectors and use things like XOR and so on. And so there's a whole slew of operators and everything which let you do this kind of stuff. And for all of them, being able to do cleanup is pretty important. That is, you need to be able to recognize when you have a valid representation, right? When it's a concept that's one that you're familiar with already. So as I mentioned, it's a kind of associative memory. In the case of cleanup, it's auto-associative, meaning you're trying to get out the vector that's sort of hiding under the noise of your input. You can more generically think of this as heteroassociative, meaning that if I just want to associate any two random concepts, you can also use a similar sort of structure. And we've used this particular cleanup memory in that kind of way in a lot of models. But today we're really just going to focus most on the auto-associative nature. And as I mentioned, it's a problem that's been around, and so there are lots of solutions. There are things like feed-forward networks. The famous Hopfield network can be thought of as a kind of cleanup memory. You can use sort of local inhibition or winner-take-all sorts of techniques. The network that we're going to talk about, we've found to be really good at scaling and also very robust to implementation and spikes. So the cleanup memory that we use, it can scale really well, as I mentioned. So let me show you a graph which demonstrates this. So what we're looking at in this graph is a bunch of lines where what these lines are indicating are being able to decode with 99% accuracy the items in bound pairs, and the number of pairs is indicated by the color of the line. So this is 2, 4, 6, and 8 bound pairs added together. The number of dimensions in the vector representation is on this side. And so we're implementing all of this in neurons. So the number of neurons per dimension is just set and remains constant at 10. And then the line that we're plotting is showing 99% accuracy. So as long as we can encode and be right 99% of the time, then that'll sort of fall below this line. And then the other most important thing is perhaps on this axis, this is this number of possible terms that can be selected to be bound and summed together. So I put a dotted line here at 60,000 terms. And the reason I did that is because this is the size of the vocabulary of the average college-educated adult, 60,000 terms. As you can see, we can have 60,000 terms in a vocabulary. So each one of those terms is like, you know, cat, dog, the things that Terry was adding in. So 60,000 is lots. And we can still, with only about 400 dimensions, just less than 400 dimensions, be able to decode 8 pairs of those things bound and summed together with 99% accuracy. So this is quite a good memory. It means that we're, you know, doing really good scaling and that the cleanup is quite effective, right? We're getting 99% back to the correct answers whenever we're doing this unbinding. And of course, the noise in this case is coming from the fact that we're just adding a whole bunch of vectors together. As Terry was mentioning, as you cram more and more neurons, or excuse me, as you cram more and more concepts into your vector space, they'll be essentially getting closer and closer together. And so you will have to find out whether you can clean them up. And here we're doing it also in the context of adding neural noise, so all the spiking and everything as well. If we look at how many neurons it takes quite a few neurons to do the cleanup and binding necessary to implement this entire sort of system. So where we'd be basically taking 2 items, binding them together, adding them into a representation, and then doing the unbinding and cleaning them up. It takes a lot of neurons, but there are so many neurons in the brain that it only works out to about 9 square millimeters of cortical space to do all of those operations effectively. Why does this work? Like, why can we cram 60,000 different unique identifiable vectors, even though it's noisy and everything, into a 400-dimensional space? The answer is one that I will discuss when we come back. First, I'm going to send this over to Terry to show you the implementation in Nengo and to describe to you basically how neurons are being organized in order to effectively implement this in a feed-forward network. I will also quickly comment that because it's a feed-forward network, it tends to be extremely fast. This 10 millisecond is basically indicative of the fact that you're going through about 2 synapses. So, you know, it's very quick. Terry?
Okay, so thanks, Chris. So let's go and add in a cleanup memory here. First thing we're gonna do is gonna save this as a new file, spot 3. Now, since we're gonna actually have a neural network that is specifically looking for particular vectors, this is now a situation where our neural network itself, when it comes time to build the network, we need to know what those vectors are beforehand. So the first thing we need to do is show you the syntax for actually saying, hey, look, we're gonna go define some vectors and make use of those rather than just randomly generating things through the user interface. Okay. So we're going to call a collection of vectors, we're going to call that a vocabulary. we're going to make one of these. Say vocabulary. And the one parameter that's important there is, well, what's the dimensionality of those vectors? We didn't specify this beforehand, so in the previous examples, just Nengo was just automatically generating one of these for us and just automatically filling it in with stuff as we defined new things. But we don't want to, but we want to sort of manually force it to automatically to fill in some things right now. Okay. And so there's a command for that. It's called populate. And now we can give it some text that says, okay, here's just, I want you to predefine a bunch of vectors. And again, if I had particular vector or particular values that I wanted these vectors to be, I could specify that. I don't for this example, so I'm just simply going to say, hey, randomly generate a vector blue and red and square and circle. Circle, so make it spell correctly. So it's going to populate our vocabulary with those vectors. It's going to randomly generate them. It's going to do the same process that happened through the user interface, but it's going to do it when, before we define the model now, because we're going to need that, because all of these systems should be using this vocabulary, including the cleanup memory that we're going to go add. Okay. You can, of course, have multiple vocabularies within a very large Nengo network. So you might have part of the brain that has some terms that it has access to and other parts of the brain that have other terms. For this example, we're going to use the same vocabulary everywhere. And what we're going to do to sort of indicate that all of these things are using the same vocabulary is, instead of specifying D, the number of dimensions, we're actually just going to give it the vocabulary. So this is saying, just go ahead and use that vocabulary, and all of them are using the same vocabulary. So everything is all predefined. This is not going to change anything but the neural network yet. So at the moment, those vocabularies are the only thing those are being used for. Is it's checking, okay, what's the dimensionality of that vocabulary? Fine, so that's how it knows how many neurons to make. But then the only other thing that vocabulary is being used for is this graphical interface. So when it's making these visual displays. That's true about the state. This component we wrote to make, though, is actually going to use that vocabulary that we specify in order to generate the neural model. Okay. So this is going to be our cleanup. And we're going to, and this in particular is, we're calling this is a thresholding associative memory. So that's the simplest cleanup, the cleanup system that Chris was talking about. There's a few other variants that we've explored that are also included in SPA, but this is sort of the simplest one. And we need to tell it, okay, the vocabulary of things that it's expecting is this one that we've defined. And we need to tell it some sort of threshold. So what this threshold is saying is, when I'm building these neurons, fine, they're looking for they're looking for the 4 particular vectors that are here. So we're saying, hey, I want neurons that are looking for blue, looking for red, looking for square, looking for circle. The point of this network is I'm feeding in something that's kind of close to blue, red, square, or circle. And if it's kind of close to any of those, then the output should be exactly blue or exactly red or exactly square or exactly circle. Right? That's the intent of a cleanup memory. And of course, if I feed in something that's not near any of them, then it should output 0, okay, the vector 0. And so what this threshold is saying is, well, how close is close enough? Okay. And as always, we use sorts of the dot product as our similarity measure. So we're going to say, dot product of 0.3, somewhere around there. That's going to be our cutoff. Okay. One other parameter we have to specify is, well, what terms in this vocabulary am I going to be optimizing this network, this cleanup memory for? Is it, and in this case, we want to look for all of them, but there's all sorts of cases where you might want to use a subset. But we're just going to say, all right, just go, yeah, we can just specify this as, well, I want to look for blue, I want to look for red, I want to look for square, I want to look for circle. Okay, so this is saying, please build me a network So this neural network should, you feed in a 64-dimensional vector input, and the output should be either blue, red, square, or circle, or nothing, or 0, depending on whether that input is close to those things. We, of course, actually need to connect something up to that, so we can go from answer to cleanup. So that has made that little connection there. And I'm going to right-click on cleanup and pull up a cloud. Let me run that, and then we'll go ahead and look at the internals and see what exactly ended up happening there, and sort of get a sense as to how that's working. There. So I'm going to feed in blue, feed in circle. My memory now has blue circle in it. I'm going to query blue. I get out, and you'll see down here, so in my actual answer is somewhat close to square, pretty close to circle, but it is also a little bit close to square. If we go and look at the cleaned up answer, first of all, it's way less noisy. You're not seeing any of that jitter in size, right? And again, since the size of this text was related to the dot product of the represented vector and the actual ideal answer, so that jitter that you're visually seeing there, that is the same as that jitter up and down that you were seeing on the value plots, where the lines that were being drawn would jitter up and down a little bit. So this is a much cleaner answer, and is much close, and is very, very close to circle. It is a little tiny bit close to square, but you know, much, much, much less than this one. Again, none of these systems are perfect. We take away this input, take away this input, and then what will generally happen, you know, if I go ahead and ask for, I don't know, let's ask for circle, I should get a blue out. My cleanup memory switches over to blue pretty well. Ask it for something that's not in memory. I ask it for red. I get nothing. It's great. And then if we let that run for a while, what would happen is eventually the memory would decay enough, would just drift away from the ideal memory enough. This answer would eventually get small enough, would eventually be smaller than the threshold, and then my cleanup would no longer find anything. If we want to actually know a little bit of what's going on inside that cleanup, really all it's doing is it's got a group of neurons that is looking for each of those individual terms. And it is literally computing the dot product from those inputs into those terms. And then the output is just simply computing, you know, is the value greater than that threshold? So it is just built up using the sorts of components you've already seen, plus some nice tricks for for organizing the neuron tuning curves such that it's good at computing that particular thresholding function. And I think that's it. Back to you, Chris.
Great, thanks, Terry. So you put 4 items into your 64-dimensional space, but in fact, there's a lot room for many more. And as I mentioned when I was showing the graph of the work you had done earlier with the cleanup memory, we noticed that when you get to 400 dimensions, you could easily stick 60,000 different things. You could bind them and sum 8 of them together, 8 pairs of them together, and still decode it with 99% accuracy. Why does that happen? Just to give a very quick intuition of this, we can look at what happens as we go to higher and higher dimensional spaces. So what we're doing here is plotting for different dimensionalities, how many vectors you can fit in that are 10 degrees away from one another, right? So these are all unit vectors, and all we're doing is saying, okay, in a 2-dimensional space, we got to make sure everything is 10 degrees away from everything else. How many vectors do we get in? Well, you get about 36, 360 degrees in a circle. If you do the same thing in 3 dimensions, you get way more, right? So more than 10 times more, you get 413 vectors. As you move up to an 8-dimensional system, you get on the order of 6 million vectors that can be 10 degrees apart from each other. This is a crazy scaling factor, right? So we can see this is going up extremely fast. So when you get to high numbers of dimensions like 400, you can fit, probably quadrillions of vectors that are 10 degrees apart. But even vectors that need to be on the order of 20 degrees apart or something like that, we can fit enough of them so that even with noise and neural activities and all kinds of sort of challenges for such vector spaces, we can still successfully put 60,000 different items in there and be able to tell them apart when we're putting a bunch more items in there, when we bind them together and sum them and all that kind of stuff. So essentially, these high dimensional spaces are really just fantastic for storing stuff, right? There's a lot of room in high dimensions, which is exactly what we're taking advantage of when we're building these kinds of networks that are representing syntactic structure using binding operators and superposition operators, right? We're always staying within the same dimensionality of space, which is good because then we have a fixed number of resources we need to represent that space. And as long as we have enough dimensions, there's going to be enough sort of different positions for us in order to scale things. All right, so that's basically why it works. But we still run into scaling problems. So even though there's tons and tons of space in a high dimensional space, we can begin to ask ourselves, well, like 8 different pairs of properties doesn't seem like a lot when we think about concepts, right? So if we're imagining for a minute that our concept is essentially going to be a collection of these slot and fillers, is 8 enough? And it probably doesn't seem like it is. So think about the bird of robin, right? So when we think about a robin, we might have a bunch of visual properties of a robin, right? So it could be the case that robins have red breasts and have gray backs and have short beaks and are, a certain size. And then we could think about auditory features, that certain kinds of sounds that robin make, ones in springs, one when they're angry, ones when they're happy, and all kinds of things. We can think about how robins feel, what other kinds of birds are related to robins or look similar to robins. We can think about all the parts of a robin. And when we begin to sort of cash out what one of these concepts might include, it tends to get to be much more than 8 slots and fillers. So of course, 8 isn't the limit, but the question is, like, what is the limit? And if we run into that limit, what are we going to do, right? Beyond that, we've also got a bunch of other things. There's, beyond all the perceptual features, we've got a bunch of other relationships we might want to be encoding and so on. So concepts are complicated, right? And because concepts are complicated, we're going to want to think about whether or not we can use these techniques and scale up to like fairly large size representations. And of course, be able to clean them up and decode them, right? So how do we decode these very large structures? Clearly 8 pairs isn't enough. So why didn't we go farther on our graph? Basically because we have a fun solution to this problem. And that is that we can make these cleanup memories exist in a sort of hierarchy, right? So what do I mean by that? So imagine that you have a cleanup memory of the kind that we described on the previous slide and that you implemented. Suppose that we can decode 8 pairs. What if for each of those pairs, we could decode whatever's in those pairs with similar accuracy, right? So the idea being, slot number 1 can have, any of 60,000 different items, and those 60,000 different items could then be decoded to another 60,000 different items, and so on and so forth. So we can keep our vocabulary constant, and we can basically chain the cleanup memories such that if they're independent, we essentially, for every layer in the hierarchy, we can multiply the number of things that we can encode. Okay, so if 8 is our limit, then if we have 2 layers in our hierarchy, we would be able to do 64. If we have 3 layers, we can, keep going and scale that thing up pretty quickly. All right, so what happens when we actually do this? So here's an example where we are assuming we have 60,000 terms in our vocabulary. We're using 500 dimensions. And what we can see when we look across these examples is how the performance will change. So this is looking at what happens if we just increase the number of bound pairs in a single memory, right? So this is what we looked at in the previous slide. You can see that we do fairly well out to about 10 pairs, right? And that might be because we have 500 dimensions instead of about 400 on the previous slide. But after 10 pairs, things start declining pretty quickly, right? So 90% accuracy at about 20 pairs. So that's not great. So one thing we could do is just add more dimensions. What we're showing in this graph down here is what happens if you double the number of dimensions. And you notice that if you double the number of dimensions, you get about twice as many pairs. So now you're up to 20 pairs. That's better, but it's not great, right? We might need a whole ton of dimensions. As we have more and more dimensions, it does make the complexity of our binding operators go up significantly. You know, it can really cost a lot of resources. Instead, if we chain or have like these hierarchical cleanup memories, we can essentially, you know, get perfect decoding all the way across this graph, right? So here we're just plotting up to 80 sets of pairs, and we can get, you know, at least 80, probably on the order of about 100, because as I said, you've got 10 times 10. And so down here, I've, you know, now changed this axis entirely, right? I've scaled this axis significantly by 5 times. And even at 400 pairs, right, we're getting an accuracy of about 85% or so. 85% might not be good enough, but 400 pairs of items seems like it's probably enough to encode most of the relationships that we want. This is, of course, an empirical question, but we you know, do have some insight into the complexity of the kinds of hierarchies that people have. And actually, I'm going to talk about one of those now. In order to set the stage for this example, let's think about the scaling problem while keeping in mind some pretty specific numbers. So for number 1, we know that the brain is about 2,500 centimeters square of cortex. We also know that there are about 100,000 neurons per square millimeter. Suppose that we have a vocabulary in which we have 60,000 terms, right? So as I mentioned, this is the size of the average adult human vocabulary for English. So that's, let's say, 40,000 nouns and 20,000 verbs. That is a number I'm just making up. But you know, there's gonna be some number of nouns and some number of verbs. And suppose that, you know, any 2 nouns can enter into a relation around a verb. Carl gave the book to Julia. That would actually be 3 nouns entering into a relationship. So, you know, we're keeping things a little bit simple by just assuming that, you know, the dog chased the cat. We just have verbs like that, where we only got 2 nouns entering into a relationship defined by a verb. Okay, so now we can start thinking about how are we going to scale in order to represent all of those relationships. And as you can see, this is kind of getting at the same issue with scaling up conceptual vocabulary or conceptual structure. So people have suggested all kinds of different ways of doing this. One is to use synchrony. So there's a model called LISA in which they suggest that you know, we can take some insights from proposals from neuroscience in the 90s, where they said it seems like neurons that are in sync might be encoding, solving the binding problem. In fact, the exact one that you were talking about, Terry. The challenge there is that their solution does not scale. So for a vocabulary with 60,000 terms, 40,000 nouns, 20,000 verbs, and only sort of these 2-part relations, they would need 160 million centimeters of cortex. So that's way too many. And the reason that it doesn't scale very well is because essentially the hypothesis in this model, I think it might be safe to say this is the kind of model Hinton was thinking about with his quote. The hypothesis in that model is essentially you have a new set of neurons for every possible combination of nouns and verbs. And that just means it's going to scale exponentially badly. So, you know, this is a case where when we really think carefully about scaling, maybe that particular suggestion is not a great one. Another suggestion, there's something called the ICS, which stands for Integrated Connectionist Symbolic Architecture. So this uses something like circular convolution. It's a different operator. That operator actually doesn't scale as well because instead of doing compression, it essentially keeps around all of the information about all the combinations. And for that reason, to do the representation of a vocabulary of this type I described, you would need about 625 centimeters of cortex, which on the face of it sounds not too bad. It's definitely less than 2,500 square centimeters. Unfortunately, when you look at all of the areas of the brain that have anything to do with language, you run into a number of about 400 square centimeters. So it's too big from that perspective. And more importantly, this is just for representation of the vocabulary, terms, and relations, right? So there's still a lot more to do in language. And as I mentioned, this is already clearly a simplified vocabulary. Another suggestion is called the neural blackboard architecture. This is quite an interesting suggestion. It has some specific neural circuits that are hypothesized to act kind of like temporary binders. There's a lot of detail on exactly how those circuits are set up. Unfortunately, it also doesn't scale that well. I've argued that it would take about 480 square centimeters. After speaking to the people who wrote that paper and proposed that architecture, they convinced me, well, maybe it's smaller, maybe it's around 100 square centimeters. I still think that's a huge problem because, again, we're only talking about representation of clearly and overly simplified vocabulary. And in contrast, to represent that kind of vocabulary in the SPA, it would only take about 5 millimeters squared of cortex, right? Maybe as large as 9, as I said before, but sub 1 centimeter. And I think this is good news because, as I mentioned, I think we're highly underestimating how complex vocabularies and concepts and so on are when we pretend that we're just going to work with a 60,000 term vocabulary with some nouns and verbs. What about adjectives and adverbs and all those many other parts of speech? What about doing grammar and manipulating things with past tense and future tense and on and on and on? So it's good that we basically are scaling so well using these techniques, and I think scaling a lot better than previous suggestions about how to represent these sort of symbol-like structures in the brain. So using the techniques that we've talked about so far, we can encode a vocabulary of about 60,000 terms in about 5 square millimeters. Now we've actually scaled that up significantly beyond just the 60,000 terms to something with 100,000 concepts. And I'm going to talk about that work next. So in this work, what we've done is taken WordNet. So this is a sort of hand-encoded representation of conceptual relations across the English language. So you'll notice there's 100,000 concepts here, which is bigger than the sort of average adult vocabulary size. There are also about 13 levels in the hierarchy. So there's a bunch of relations between all these concepts, focusing on the is a relation. So just imagine, you could have a concept like dog, and a dog is an animal, and or dog is a mammal is an animal, and so on. So you get these relationships, and of course a chihuahua is a dog, so there's another level. Anyway, so in this WordNet, there are 13 levels to the hierarchy, and so we built a model with a couple million neurons in which we encoded all of that information, and then we could test how well can we decode it. And so what we're showing here is that the decoding accuracy is basically perfect, meaning that for any word, if we query it with that word, it can basically generate the representation for that word, and we can begin to determine the relationship between that word and other concepts. We gave it a hierarchy traversal challenge, which means that we would give it a starting concept and an ending concept, and it would have to tell us if they were in a conceptual relation or not. If we said chihuahua and mammal, it should say yes. And if we said carrot and mammal, it should say no. So you can see that it's doing a pretty good job. It's getting about 95% correct. And so that suggests that we not only can encode a fairly complicated conceptual structure, but we can also query and we can move through it in useful kinds of ways. And then the last thing we wanted to show is that we can in fact also encode fairly sophisticated sentence structures, and then decode those concepts and then do things like hierarchy traversal. So to generate enough sentences in order to collect sort of good statistics, we essentially randomly generated them and ended up with sentences kind of like this. So these are grammatically well formed, but you'll notice that they're a lot more complicated than just having a verb and a couple of nouns. So for instance, here we've got the spider slowly knit the lamp the dog stole. So we've got embedded clauses. It doesn't make any sense, of course, but it's got articles and embedded clauses and adverbs and all kinds of fun stuff. So all of those things are decodable and then queryable. And so when we presented the system with these kinds of encoded sentences, then it could decode them with about 99% accuracy, meaning that it could basically parse them and tell you anything you wanted to know about relationships between the concepts in the sentence and any other concept in its conceptual structure. All right, so although again, I think we're still much simpler than real language, right? We've got more sort of words in our vocabulary, but we definitely don't have as many complicated relationships as in a real vocabulary. This is I think, gone a lot farther than previous work in demonstrating something near human scale representation of concepts and relationships between concepts. So that fills us with some hope that, using and this was all done in spiking neurons, so using spiking neurons, implementing circular convolution and addition and cleanup memories of the kind we've described does hold the promise to be able to scale to really big models and very large vocabularies while using reasonable numbers of neurons, reasonable numbers of resources. Okay, so just to summarize what we've seen in the lecture so far, we ran into these things called semantic pointers. We described how semantic pointers are these state space representations or just vectors that are represented in spiking neurons. We think they're a bit special insofar as they are generated by compression operators. There's a wide variety of compression operators. We talked about ones in the visual system, in the motor system, and in cognitive systems. So those cognitive compression operators were the circular convolution and summation that we talked about. Because we're doing this kind of compression, it means that they tend to be quite efficient for manipulation. So it allows us to encode really large vocabularies and conceptual structures and manipulate those all within a reasonable number of resources, as I mentioned, a couple of million neurons. And for this reason, they are quite useful for structured representations. So, we looked at how to represent rules, and of course, Spawn is an example of using structured representations and inferring them and generating them, and as well as semantic ones. So be that encoding of conceptual structure or relating a conceptual representation to a visual representation. So again, this is exactly the kind of thing that happens in Spawn. So with that, we'll stop here. And the next lecture will focus on the last two parts of the semantic pointer architecture, those being control and learning and memory. And that will conclude this final part of this set of lectures where we're talking about scaling. There might be additional lectures in the series. We'll see who we can get to, add their 2 cents in here. But for now, we'll say goodbye and hope that you come back to see the last lecture on scaling. See ya.
Right. See you next time.